I would like to speak in Irish, but I don't think that's going to be okay for everybody. So I'm only joking. We Irish have to joke about everything. It is a great privilege for me to be invited to honor Heide on the occasion of her 80th birthday. Heide has been a real inspiration to me for many years, even though we have not been much in contact, but I have read her work and used it with my teaching. And so I'm very honored to be invited here today. I have brought a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to now share my screen so that it'll be easy for people to follow what I'm going to say. Okay, I would like to thank you for making this possible. I'm sorry for the confusion. I'm speaking today in relation to Heide's work on matriarchy. And when she wrote her book on matriarchal studies, I noticed that there was nothing about Ireland. Therefore, I asked her why, and she said it was because we didn't have the evidence. And so to honor her work and to expand her work a little bit in Europe, I thought I would honor her best by offering a few reflections on matriarchy in Ireland. Now, there were many ancient writers who wrote about Ireland just before the Common Era. People like Ptolemy, like some Greek writers, like Julius Caesar, like Saint Jerome, and they named the indigenous people of Ireland the Picts, the Britanni, or the Cruithan. And they gave us very interesting information. Caesar wrote about polyandry. They mentioned that women officiated in religious rites. They said that the Irish writers remarked that this provides evidence that early Ireland contained a population that differed fundamentally from the Celts and the other Indo-Europeans. So we have evidence of a pre-Celtic strata in Irish population. In the 19th and 20th centuries, several writers spoke also about matriarchy: Heinrich Zimmer, Julius Pokorny, Marie-Louise Shesta, Owen MacNeill, and Robert Stewart McAllister. More recently, the professor of Irish Studies at Harvard, Tomás O'Cahasey, wrote an article on the importance of the sister's son in early Irish literature. And yet he said it is worth mentioning, however, that it has long been established that the occasion or the occurrence in a given society of the institution of the avunculate does not have any value whatever as evidence that the society is or was matrilineal or patriarchal. Nevertheless, when we go back to the late 19th century and 20th century writers, they were a great deal more open to the possibility of some kind of matriarchal society, although they didn't necessarily call that. Owen MacNeill, he wrote about marriage, and he said the older Pictish law of succession in the maternal line must have reduced the factor of traditional origin, something merely nominal. It facilitated intermarriage, that the Pictish women of rank married with men of the dominant race, and this inevitably led in time to the prevalence of the whole Gaelic tradition among the Picts themselves. And so he's talking there about the two factors which led to the demise of matriarchy in Ireland. One was marriage, and then the second one was violence. So the question, the Irish written records don't begin until the 5th century of the Common Era. And the Irish written records, which are very extensive, some of the most extensive records in Europe, were compiled in the monasteries, which were ruled by the very powerful and ambitious families, because the monasteries were a parallel universe with the ancient tribal systems. And so the monastic families supplanted the early states or independent social units where matriarchal systems may still have been preserved. And they introduced severe social stratification, including slavery. There's a great deal of evidence of slavery in Ireland. They also controlled the production of written material. And even though they wanted to preserve the Irish material, Owen MacNeill has written, "We cannot well avoid the conclusion that a common accord was reached among the literati, probably in the second half of the 8th century, to ignore the identity of the Irish Cruithan." That is to say, the matriarchal substrate. And for that reason, we find that the written records are very distorted. The genealogies, the annals of Ireland, and even the Dinshenicus. The Dinshenicus is the stories of how places got their names. And so we find out that the main rivers in Ireland, the Shannon, the River Boyne, and the River Liffey, all took their names from women, from Sheenan, from Boan and Lifa, but they all drowned as they gave their names to the rivers or the lakes. In other words, they gave their names and then they were killed off by the monastic writers. Even the law tracts are very patriarchal, with one exception, because the written laws, again, which are hugely important for European history, were written down in the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 7th century. But they started off by saying, why do women have to be subordinate to men? Because the Bible says so. So Christianity had an extraordinary impact on early Ireland. But there was one law tract that maintained the matriarchal substrate, and that is called the Coin Lenomna. And in that one, it says many types of marriage are recognized depending on the social status of the wife or the husband. And they give, for instance, reasons for divorce. Gossiping about what went on in the marriage bed. That was a reason for divorce. Or not giving a childbearing woman the food that she craved for during her pregnancy. The guy could be kicked out. Or, this is the best one, not keeping a pregnant woman's pelvic organs soft and supple so that her childbirth would be painless. But that's only a fairly small example of what might be possible had the earlier laws been committed to writing. So in the written tradition, we have a propaganda war against the old social order. In the Irish heroic saga, which is the Irish equivalent to Siegfried, called the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the battle takes place between Cuchulainn, who's the great hero, and Maeve, who's the goddess. And just as they were going to fight each other, Maeve said, "Hold on a minute," because she got her period and she had to go behind a mountain to relieve herself. And her flow caused several rivers to appear. There's another story, the story of Keser. And this, her grandfather Noah in the Bible, the flood was coming, but there was no room in the ark for Keser. And so Keser built an ark of her own, and she took 50 women and only 3 men to Ireland. Now, she divided the women among the men, but 2 men died of exhaustion at meeting the women's sexual needs. And the last one disappeared up a mountain and he escaped. And so he was the only one. He eventually joined a monastery where he could tell the story of the dangers of matriarchy. And so in those few examples, we can see already that there is a propaganda war being waged against matriarchy in the written sources, which makes it very difficult to determine what kind of matriarchy might have pertained, might have been operating in Ireland up to that point. And so in my work on Bridget, which I've been doing now for many years, I discovered that we have to develop strategies or special ways of attempting to isolate or identify the matriarchal substrate. And one of them would be to identify the hostile witnesses, because very often they can tell us a great deal about what they are opposing, or the hypervigilant disclaimers of the evidence. In other words, they tell us this is what St. Bridget did not do. And of course, they are trying to combat the pagan practices. And those pagan practices can still be found in the ritual traditions associated with Bridget. We have to seek the trace hauntings from the living traditions and place them alongside the written traditions, because the living traditions have maintained practices long in various parts of Ireland. And in some of those parts, the traditions of Bridget are very strong. But they have maintained evidence that did not appear in the written traditions. We have to identify the remaining traces of matriarchy in the local areas less affected by colonization. And very interestingly, 3 of those areas have very strong traditions surrounding the figure of Bridget. We have to analyze the material artifacts often used in ritual, such as Bridget's cloak, her belt, her cross, and her cloak, her belt, and her cross. And we must get the evidence from international comparisons, which in some cases have kept them much more succinctly than we did in Ireland. We need to analyze the patriarchal social structures and what are the distorted implications for women, children, and for the development of toxic masculinity. And finally, we need to ask, how is relationality cultivated or distorted in sexual politics and in the various power struggles? Now, one of the questions that I focus on most intently is the question of violence or peace. And the old maternal networks, we do have this evidence in the written traditions. People could not fight against each other within 7 degrees of kinship. The female leaders, such as the midwives, the poets, and the shamans, were responsible for peace weaving. The abbots of Kildare, up to the 12th century, were responsible for, their names were turning back the streams of war. And in the synods of the 11th and 12th century, all authority was removed from the abbesses of Kildare. In the Irish tradition, the maternal networks based on maternal blood were replaced by fosterage, and they were called the ties of milk. And they were as important as the ties of maternal blood, since foster children could not fight each other. In other words, early Ireland had different ways of making sure that peace was maintained through the kind of social and maternal networks that were established. Now, all of this was overthrown by the rise of so-called heroic cultures, and women's blood shed in menstruation and childbirth was trumped by the blood shed in sacrifice of the founders of the main monotheistic religions, or by warriors in the interminable wars that we have known throughout our lives. The bloodshed in warfare or patriarchal sacrifice establishes genealogies, rituals, and symbols supporting toxic masculinity with devastating consequences for violence for women, children, and also for men. And so for me, the work of Heide Göttner-Abendroth has been crucial in facing the challenge of recuperating Irish evidence for a matri-centered social order, or even a dialectic between the sexes. I first encountered Heide's work in her book, Societies of Peace. And I use this book extensively in my teaching in Trinity College Dublin, particularly since for over 35 years, Ireland experienced a devastating war between Republican and Loyalists. The energy in organizing these events and subsequent publications became an enormous source of personal inspiration, courage, and strength to my work in Ireland, and I thank Heide for that extensively. Her work on matriarchal studies is also an invaluable resource to those trying with great difficulty to excavate alternative ways of being in the world faced with perpetual wars, military and economic, we now experience. I've also used that book in my courses, and international students who have never been aware of their ancient matriarchal past are now responding at this point in time with great excitement. And so I have great gratitude for Heide's work in recuperating our ancient past with a view to revitalizing and renewing the violent patriarchal societies under which we now live and which has devastating implications for our planet. Finally, you know that Emma Goldman said there can never be a revolution unless we learn how to dance. In Ireland, we say there can never be a revolution unless we learn how to sing. And so I am taking I'm taking my courage in my hands. I'm going to sing a little tribute to Heide finally. This is an Irish blessing for Heide. May the road rise with you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warmly on your fields. May the rain fall softly at your feet until we meet again. May she hold you in the hollow of her hand. Thank you.